Okay. Thank you for watching. Right. Today is the first time I'm doing this book sharing session in English. So hopefully things will be smooth. And if later anybody has any questions, we can have this discussion. Of course, if you have a question in Mandarin, you can post it too. So without further delay, I will start this reading session review. As a start, we will introduce the author,藤家礼之助, and he was born in 1928, and he graduated from Waseda University in the field of literary research. He's actually a historian, and he specializes in a lot of Chinese and Japanese exchange, particularly in ancient Chinese history. And he wrote this book in 1977, first in the Japanese edition, which was then translated and published by the Peking University Press in 1982. So the edition that I'm going to share today is based on the 2019 edition and translated by Zhang Lin and published in China too. Mr. Reinosuke, he also wrote many other books. There's a long list, but I just list two examples here: A History of Japanese-Korean Exchange and one book on land reform and taxation from Han Dynasty to Southern Dynasty, and that's a pretty detailed account. So this book has all in all 10 chapters, and it is, because it was originally written in Japanese, and then I read the Chinese version, so it is a little bit of a difficulty for me to translate everything into English, but I try my best. Right, but sometimes it may not be possible always to give the definite meaning in English, but we can see, for example, chapter 3, over 10,000 miles. We may be thinking, what does it mean by over 10,000 miles? And chapter 5, the Tang ambassadors, why is it called foreign land? So there are specifics about the Chinese language itself that make it very special for the meaning of these words. So we can begin by talking about the origins of the Japanese people, and you can see on the screen there are two types of people. On the left, there's a man with a lot of beard, and on the right, there's a more slender person, and the face is slightly narrower. So the people on the left is called the Jomon culture, or the Jomon peoples. They were the original peoples of Japan. And then after that, we have the Yayoi people, which is on the right. You see the eyes, where the eyes are smaller and the eyelashes are also thinner and with less facial hair. And these peoples came actually from the Asian landmass, which is primarily of Mongol, Chinese, or Korean descent, and they crossed the ocean towards Japan. So this original Aboriginal Jomon culture, which already existed, but with the arrival of these Yayoi people from the mainland, it brought a lot of advanced metalworking and agricultural techniques. So there was a great advancement in technology. And this resulted in many changes to the local society. For example, there was a formation of small nexus, and there are people who perform ancestral rites. This was a social habit that was derived from the mainland. And as a result, there was a wealth accumulation and a widening rich-poor gap, right? And people from hunter-gatherers started to settle down and to form villages. And Mr. Reinosuke, he started the book with the Japanese king and the seal. And what's so special about this seal? It actually goes back to a 1782 discovery at the Fukuoka prefecture. And this seal, as you can see on the screen, was traced to the Eastern Han Dynasty. There is a snake carving on top, and the writing at the bottom shows that it is conferred by the Chinese Han Emperor. And subsequently, we have the 1956 discoveries at the Yunnan province, which is also a snake-carved gold seal, as well as the 1981 discovery at Yangzhou district. This seals the fact that there has been a historical proof of the Chinese and Japanese hierarchical relationship. This hierarchical relationship stems from a superior and an inferior relationship between China and Japan. And we trace the historical texts, whether it is the Hanshu or the Shanghai Jing. We saw that Japan was not a unified country at the start, and there are a lot of influences from the Chinese mainland. For example, in the book of Late Han, the War Annals, the Japanese people in the past, they were not called Japan, they were called the War people. Right, and you can see for those who understand the Chinese, the War Zhuan means this particular chapter in the whole Hanshu. So the king asked to be received by the emperor of China. So Mr. Reinosuke wrote in the text that the new kingdom, and the new kingdom actually refers to a small kingdom in Japan, receipt of the gold seal from the Chinese emperor implied that they were brought into the Chinese tributary system. And this is not just a cultural or economic sphere of influence. There is a political element to this tributary system. So we go on to a place called Yamatai. So there's a map on the top right-hand corner. This shows the islands of Japan, and crossing the Tsushima Straits, we have Korea. So sometime around BCE, before the Common Era 100, according to Chinese observation of the oceanic currents, they thought that Japan was located south. But when the seafaring technology was improved and people could cross the Tsushima Straits, then the area of northern Kyushu, which is, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, this is the part of northern Kyushu, right? It became the starting point for travel to the mainland via Korea. And the book of Late Han, War Annals, again mentions that there is a female king, the women king, called Himiko. At that time, in Japan, there were many small countries, and they were always fighting against each other. And finally, they were reunited, united by this female king, Himiko. But in 220, the Eastern Han dynasty collapsed and was replaced by the three warring states in mainland. Now, the state of Wei sent officials and as well as a gold seal to the Japanese, the war people, and Himiko also sent ambassadors to Luoyang and acknowledges the supremacy of the Wei, state of Wei. And by the 3rd century, Yamatai had became, which is located somewhere here. The actual location of Yamatai has not been founded by archaeologists, but it is thought to be somewhere around here, where Kyoto and Osaka is. This became the main Japanese kingdom, right? With Himiko's passing, the Japan states start to become a warring states, and there was a gap of 150 years where there was no exchange between China and Japan. Now, I'm going to deviate slightly from the book and talk a little bit about Korea, because Korea would prove to be a very crucial element between Chinese and Japanese exchange. So first we talk about Han Dynasty. There are 4 prefectures in the northeast on the Korean Peninsula. That's about before the Common Era in 194. So where Koryo was a renegade prefecture during the Western Han Dynasty. In 313, Koryo annexed Lelang prefecture and effectively controlling the northern part of the peninsula, which is shown on the right map, whereby the area in pink is under Koryo Lu. This Koryo was at its peak by the 5th century, and it forced the neighbors, Baekji and Silla, which is on the southern part where South Korea is today. And at that time, there was a Japanese small army which had stationed itself in Silla, which is here in orange color, Qingluo. Between the mid-3rd and mid-4th centuries, Japan had built a kingdom centered around the court and was already present in Korea. And these Japanese people, which we still call the war, they helped Baekje in their efforts to resist the Koryo, while Koryo sought the help of the Tang dynasty. So you can see it's a bit of a complicated web, whereby I'm not sure if you can see my cursor. This part of Korea had Japanese troops, and this part Northern Korea tried to take over the two southern countries. And then this part, the Northern Korea part, tried to seek help from the Tang Dynasty. Okay, so it's a bit of a complex web of interrelationships. Now, a little bit more about the Korean Peninsula, and there are some archaeological findings in China, which you can see on the screen, and as well as there are some Koryo murals, where Koryo shifted the capital to Pyongyang, and they found this Jian tomb, which was neglected for 1,500 years. When the archaeologists excavated, they found that the tomb murals showed life in Koryo, which was very, very similar to a lot of the archaeological findings in China. And they included the 4 cardinal locations like Xuanwu, Qinglong, Baihu, as well as Buddha, creator of civilization, Fuxi, as well as Nuo, and so on. So these, even the gods that were started from China, they were also worshipped in Korea. So this showed that Koryo and the Chinese Yanhuang culture effectively shared the same source. So now we move back to the book. In this book of Jin Dynasty, it is written that there are 5 kings of the War Kingdom. They sent many diplomatic envoys to offer tribute to the Southern Dynasty, with the purpose of securing recognition from the powerful Chinese in order to reinforce their influence in Korea. So it goes like this: the Chinese tributary system, in order for your kingdom to be to have presence, right? You must be acknowledged by the Chinese emperor, right? This is important. So there are many historical records in China as well as in Japan, especially the Nippon Shoki, which stated that a lot of envoys were sent to the Chinese kings. For example, the late Sakanoue no Karitamaro was actually supposed to be the grandson of the late Han Emperor, which means if we have a Japanese people that has got Chinese ancestry, it means that you are actually considered legitimate, right? And we call this a signified Japanese. This is a very important element for the Japanese people and the Japanese culture. So as with other kingdoms and states, Japan actually paid tribute to the kingdom of Wu Guo. And in so doing, since Wu acknowledged the tribute, that means Japan also obtained acknowledgement for its interest in Korea. In this way, accepting the Chinese supremacy in the East Asian political order. And that's what we call the 册封体制, right? The political order of the tributary Chinese system. So Mr. Reinosuke said that since the 3rd century, Japan has always looked east to China for acknowledgement of her interest in Korea. When we look at the Chinese history now, during the Northern and Southern dynasties, in about between 420 to 589, in Chinese what we call the Nanbei Cao, the collapse of this Western Jin dynasty saw China enter into a very, very complex and tumultuous period. China was now divided into many, many smaller dynasties. In the south, we have you can see on the right here the Song, the Qi colored in orange, and then the Liang in green, and finally the Chen in purple. These 4 areas in southern China still maintain Chinese rule, but on the north side, they were actually invaded by the nomadic tribes over here in Beiwei, and then subsequently divided into Xiwei and Dongwei, and as well as Beizhou, right? When we look at the history, because the Chinese are very historical people, whenever we set up and change dynasties, we always have historians making records. The records of the northern dynasties, there is actually no record of exchange with the Japanese people. At this moment, the Koryo entered the tributary system of the northern dynasties, but at the same time also sent envoys to the south, whereas Baekje maintained good relations with both. But in Japan, the attitude was very different. The war people ignored completely the tribal peoples of northern China and only sought to have diplomatic relations with the Song dynasty, the Qi dynasty, the Liang dynasty, as well as the Chen dynasty, only in the south, which means that the Japanese people did not acknowledge the tribal peoples which they consider as the barbarians. They only acknowledged the Chinese people, right? So Mr. Reinosuke wrote that the South inherited this Chinese tradition from the Jin, Wei, and Han dynasties, and hence was the legitimate and only authority to be acknowledged. And this was a unique Japanese stand that was maintained over 2,000 years. So China was finally unified under the Sui dynasty, and at the same time, Japan entered the Asuka period, which is in Chinese we call the Feiniao Shidai. And you can see on this map, now China has been unified in blue color under the Sui dynasty. At this time, in the 20th year, the war king from Japan sent envoys to the Sui dynasty. And in the book of Sui, it is written, the emperor of the land of the rising sun sends regards to the emperor of the land of the setting sun. Now, this is a rather unique statement because the land of the rising sun actually refers to Japan. And the land of the setting sun refers to the emperor of the Sui dynasty. Of course, this wasn't very well received from the Chinese emperor. When the Japanese envoy, is somebody making some notes on the presentation?
Yeah, okay, please refrain from making the notes. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, because I see some scribblings of blue color. Yeah, when the Japanese envoy Kono, Xiaoye Meizi, revisited, right, it was presented as the Eastern Emperor descent greets the Western Emperor. So the usage of the diplomatic language using the terms East and West was now an effort to try to calm down the relations between the Sui Emperor and the people of the war. Because imagine you try to depict China as the land of the setting sun. This is not considered proper because the Sui dynasty is considered as a superior to the other nations. But in the end, the Sui emperor still just accepted it, and for this Chinese people to consider outlying barbarians' lands as inferior, to now acknowledge Japan as an equal, was actually a great concession. So we now talk a little bit about the Sui dynasty and the Grand Canal. The Sui dynasty was an important part of China's history because during this period, there were a lot of state works, in particular the Grand Canal. When constructed, you can see in blue, it actually connects the northern parts with the southern parts. And this allowed a lot of trade and commerce as well as political stability, right? And it's divided into 4 sections and 5 systems. So there was an elaborate system to make sure that you can have the emperor visit the different areas of the country. And after 3-4 attempts to invade Koryo during 612, the Sui dynasty finally collapsed. So we have the Sui Emperor Sui Wendi and the spread of Buddhism and the Prince Shotoku. This is an important period for Japan. Buddhism spread rapidly during the northern and southern dynasties, but there were actually 2 major suppressions because it was thought to be a foreign religion. And now Sui Emperor made an effort to advance Buddhism by first making Buddhist principles the foundation of state administration. After unifying China, he prostrated himself in front of the 3 Buddhist sacraments and now proceeded to expand Buddhist learning. So, in Japan, Prince Shotoku, he sent the envoy again to China 5 times between 600 and 614 to try to learn, to bring Buddhism to Japan. And it is this period that Chinese horticulture and Buddhist rites were brought into Japan, and which developed into what we now know as Ikebana. And the Sui annals actually wrote, the war king has heard the reinvention of the great land. This great land meaning the Japanese people now knows in China a new dynasty has been formed. So Japan actively absorbed all the Sui institutions and regulations. And at this time, there were also many native Japanese, but they now went to China and they absorbed Chinese culture. And especially these Chinese culture elites, they studied a lot of the history and the etymology of the Chinese characters, and some stayed for very, very long periods of time. So we have now, after the Sui dynasty ended, the Tang dynasty began. The Tang dynasty is a very, very crucial period for Japanese culture because it is characterized by a lot of absorption. So this is primarily a continuation of earlier envoys to the Sui to learn Chinese laws, administration, and Buddhism, and to recce Chinese activities on the Korean peninsula, because the Japanese people, they are always interested in Korea and they want to see what the Chinese people influence on Korea is like. In this reading session, I may have a lot of information, pictures, or maps originally in Chinese and Japanese, but I will try to explain in English as much as possible. So in Korea, the 2 countries, Shilla and Baekje, they were always in the war, and the Tang dynasty sent an expedition to try to subdue Korea. And in contrast, the Japanese diplomatic mission now sends the 2nd and 3rd batches of envoys to the Tang dynasty. And the year 663 actually saw the first international Sino-Japanese battle, the Battle of the Baichunjiang, where the Tang fleet overcame the Japanese, which means Japanese lost, and the Baekje Empire was overthrown. So this was the first war between the Chinese and the Japanese under the Tang dynasty. And this defeat was very crucial for the Japanese. It caused the Japanese to review their policy towards Korea. And since the Japanese lost to the Chinese, the Tang Empire, it forced that Japan started to want to learn from the Tang. That means the Japanese thought, hey, if we actually lost to them, then there must be something good about the Tang. Right, so they started to absorb Tang technology, culture, and systems, and this went on to the Tang's influence on the Korean peninsula, especially when Japan and Silla re-established ties. And in return, the Tang sent 2,000-man fleet to Japan, and this shocked Japan again. So in terms of the military aspect, the Tang was very, very strong. In that case, is very knowledgeable about the Book of Rites and well versed in the Chinese classics, very well dressed and with a magnificent belt. And Ason is well versed in the classics, history, and literature, well mannered and scholarly. So this is how the Tang people saw that the Japanese came to learn from them. When we saw northern nomads invading China, a large populations was dispersed, and there was a lot of anarchy, especially in the northern part. And the Japanese aristocracy, they thought that after 150 years of sending people to the Sui and the Tang dynasty to learn, they thought that, I think maybe we have learned enough. and the interest in learning from the Chinese started to decline, because now Japan felt that it had already absorbed the best and the brightest of Tang culture. Let's deviate a little bit from this book and understand a little bit about the geography between China, Japan, and Korea. You can see on the map here, there are actually 3 routes between Japan and China. The first route is called the Northern Route, and this is basically from Osaka all the way to Shandong. You can see this red line, right? It routes to the southern coast of Korea to reach Penglai. Right. In the early diplomatic envoys, they practically only use this route because it's near the land, it's safer. And then we have a south route, which is from Hakata, modern-day Fukuoka, which is here, if you can see my cursor, all the way to the mouth of the Yangtze River here. And finally, we have the Southern Islands route, which is along Kyushu, through the Ryukyu Islands, all the way to the Hangzhou Bay. Okay, so maybe we just for a moment try to remember a little bit about these 3 routes, because it will come in very familiar when we talk about the book further on. This South Islands route, especially, because when you have the tip traipsing towards the islands, it actually has a very high failure rate, because at that time, Japanese boat making skills were very modest, and they were flat structures because the boats were only sailing on the inland seas, not over the open seas, and as such they couldn't accommodate to the very high winds. And they also didn't understand the wind structure. So a little bit also more on the geography for the Asian monsoonal winds. You can see on the left, which is the northwest monsoon in January, the winds typically flow from the high air pressure areas in mainland Asia, through India, through China, outwards towards Japan, towards Australia. And in this case, if the ship tries to go towards Japan, it will be blown southwards. Okay, but in July, during the southeast monsoon, the winds turn the other direction, and now if you try to go to Japan, you'll be difficult to go against the wind, so the travel is difficult. Okay. So between the Chinese and the Japanese exchange, we have one person who is called Abe no Nakamaro. He was one of the talented students and monks on exchange along these diplomatic envoys. Maybe let's talk a little bit about him. He was born in 698, and he actually went to Chang'an at age 20, and he had a Chinese name, Chao Heng, to study at the Imperial College. And he passed all the exams to be given an official status. He was very, very well looked upon by the Tang Emperor Xuanzong, and he had many, many friends, which included the poets Li Bai and Wang Wei at the highest levels. And he stayed in China for a long time, over 30 years, and finally he asked from the court to return to Japan at age 56. He wrote a poem called Wang Xiang Shi, and loosely translated, right? I made a small translation here. Chin up, I glance across the endless sky. How I wish I could be back at Nara, atop the Mikasa mountain, thinking of the bright moon. I mean, for a Japanese to be so well schooled in Chinese and to compose Chinese poetry, that means that their acceptance and love of the Chinese culture is very, very strong. During the 14th reign of Tianbao, Abe and another friend Fujihara, they returned to Chang'an only to meet with the Anshi rebellion, and they escaped to Sichuan. He was then assigned to protect Zhennan. By 770, he was already in China for 53 years. and he finally died in Chang'an at the age of 73. So now in Nara, the city of Nara, in 1979, erected a monument to Abe no Nakamaro, as well as the city of Xi'an also made the same memorial to him. On his return trip to Japan, he met with a storm and never arrived at destination. When Li Bai heard the news, he was very sad. He thought his dear friend had drowned, and he wrote the poem "Tears for the Revered Chao Heng," which means, I loosely translated as my Japanese friend, the talented poet Chao Heng, is leaving the capital on a voyage around Penghu. Penghu is in Shandong. It is the state of, it is the place where he departs for Japan. The moon has sunk to the turquoise sea, and the clouds are imbued with autumnal colors. So through this poem, Li Bai tries to convey his emotions for his very good friend. He will miss his friend very, very deeply. And Abe was on the first of 4 ships which actually drifted to Vietnam, and a lot of the people on the ships died, and there were only 10 survivors. When he came back to China and he actually read Li Bai's poem, he wrote in response another poem called Longing for Home. It is in red, and I will loosely translate here. 30 years I lived in Chang'an. I could not return to Penghu. The longing for my hometown is as far as the horizon. My soul has returned. I feel my dear friend's heartache. I weep for you, my friend, that I can no longer be here in Chang'an. I think when we read this exchange, this literary exchange between the 2 great poets, we can feel that their friendship transcends countries and distances and times. So this is one reflection of the very deep exchange between the Chinese and the Japanese peoples. So we go on to another person called Jian Zhen. This Sino-Japanese relationship was not unidirectional, because when we saw for Abe no Nakamaro, he was actually a Japanese person going to China to learn from the Chinese. We have a Chinese person called Jian Zhen who actually visited Japan. He was a monk. After his ordainment in Yangzhou, he had a mission to spread Buddhism to Japan, and he left in 742. There was historical records of the great monk to Japan, and he writes that his mission was full of ordeals. There were 5 failed voyages, and you can see I wrote in this map here. This is second journey. He stopped here because the winds were very bad. And then on the 5th journey, he actually set out towards Japan. But on the green route, he was actually blown all the way to Hainan Island. Okay, off track. And along the way, he lost 36 of his disciples. So to commemorate the 1,200th year of Jian Zhen's mission to Japan, the Chinese government today built a memorial at Zhangjiagang in 1963 and erected a Buddhist statue over here, which is where my cursor is. And this has since expanded into a museum, which is the Jianzhen Dongdu Jinianguan, which I actually had a chance to visit last year and refurbished in 2004. Over there, there are many scripts and things to see, but I mentioned here this was written by Tang Xuanzong to the Japanese envoys. 贵国天皇发愤图强，一经求治，无比清雅。文化交流有赖互访，邦交为重，协和乃昌。中日唇齿，兄弟友邦，双星齐耀，日月同光。Loosely translated, it actually means the emperor descent of your country, assiduous in endeavors, seeking governance without respite, has my admiration, right? Means the Tang emperor writing to the Japanese emperor, saying that cultural exchange depends on bilateral visits, and the diplomatic missions to both sides make for harmony and prosperity. The Sino-Japanese relationship is almost like the lips and the teeth. We are brothers, like stars shining brightly, sharing the same sun and moon. So this is the kind of relationship that the Chinese and the Japanese had back in the Tang Dynasty. And over here, Jianzhen's brought a lot of treasures to Japan. As a result, the Japanese Emperor Shomu invited him to continue to spread Buddhism, and he visited 6 times, bringing a lot of influence to Japan. What did he bring? Especially the treasures of the 6th trip. He brought all the Buddhist scriptures, the Nirvana scripture and the Mahayana method, and all the great Tang records of the Western regions, as well as the Jin Dynasty, Wang Xizhi's calligraphic works. After 11 years, at age 66, he secretly boarded the 9th Envoy Return Fleet. And when he arrived at Nara, he constructed the Buddhist Academy at Todaiji, as well as the Tosho Daiji. And this is actually, the building is a replica of the Shanxi Foguang Si, and he received the highest honors in Japanese society. Jianzhen died at 76 years old in AD 763, and he was buried at Tosho Daiji, where he helped build. By bringing Chinese culture, Jianzhen was accelerating the development of Buddhism, medicine, architecture, and sculpture in Japan. And while he became blind at the end of his life, Reinosuke wrote that he became the illumination representing the best of Sino-Japanese exchange. So besides Jianzhen, we have the Japanese people themselves. They originally were a slave society run along tribes. And Prince Shotoku, he wanted to learn from the Chinese, especially the Tang culture. And he had the promulgation of the 17 laws. 国米二君，民无二主，率土造民，以王为主. This actually means there are no 2 kings in one country, nor 2 rulers among the populace. This vast land with 1 million people must vouch for the king. So what was it that he tried to introduce to Japan? We have the records of the Nippon Shoki, which records in great detail how the advanced Chinese culture of the Sui and Tang dynasties was introduced into Japan. And in this reform edict, he says Japan must copy China and Tang dynasty. And this whole-scale reproduction of Tang culture became the cornerstone of the Japanese culture. And we see this in primarily 4 areas. Japanese society was now organized according to Chinese society, with nationalization of the lands and the warehouses, and the tribes now became citizens. And in terms of the economy, there is now a rental labor system of taxation, right? Where the peasants will pay taxes, and this is reviewed every 6 years. We also have political changes, and now Japan have a centralized government like China, with 9 provinces split into different administrative levels. And there was also a military reform with a central authority comprising of 5 departments and multiple local districts with local defense units. And this is all very similar to the Tang system with conscription armies, whereby if there is peace, the peasants will continue to till their land. But if there is war, the nation now has the power to have all these peasants transform into the military soldiers. So these Taika reform resulted in a lot of improvements to Japan's culture, right? Especially in terms, firstly, in terms of the writing, based on Chinese characters, kibi, invented the hiragana script, which you see on the top right-hand corner, all these syllabaries. And also the envoy Kukai also invented the katakana script, which of the Chinese characters, whereas the bottom are from the sides of the Chinese characters. Besides that, there was also the spread of the calligraphy of the Wang family as the highest standard. That means in future, every Japanese should endeavor to write like Wang Xizhi. The Tang in literature had also a deep influence on the classical poetry of the Manyo Shu and the Kai Fu So, as well as the spread of Buddhism introduced the 6 Buddhist sects. And in terms of architecture, just now the pictures that you saw, Tang style architecture and temples in Nara and Kyoto, as well as Confucianism, following the Tang Emperor Xuanzong. Japan also established Confucius as the Wenxuan Wang. Besides that, we have learning from the Tang in terms of the art and the painting and sculpture, where we see influences of Dunhuang. And in terms of technology, in terms of medicine, acupuncture, sports, we also have the absorption of the social observation rites of the Chinese. For example, the Chinese tea ceremony, the floral ceremony, playing chess became Go in Japan, as well as the rites of kneeling. Besides that, all the Tang instruments were absorbed into Japan. Right, so on the bottom picture, you see a Japanese court, and their musical instruments are basically a copy from the Tang dynasty. And at the heart of it was Buddhism, the Asuka period. Because Prince Shotoku was a very fervent Buddhist, when the Sui dynasty saw a flowering of Buddhism, and when Japan absorbed Buddhism under him, it absorbed the totality of Buddhist philosophy as interpreted through the Chinese northern and southern, as well as the Sui dynasties. Through these envoy fleets, the generations and generations of exchange students and monks, they came and they learned and they absorbed, and they were so inspired by Chinese culture, and they wanted to return back to Japan to rebuild Japan as a replica of China. And today, when we go to Japan and you look at the currency, the 10,000 yen, you can actually see Prince Shotoku, his painting on the currency. So this is the impact of the Tang dynasty. So as the Tang dynasty was ending, the Japanese thought that they had already to the visits, right? Because it is too dangerous. And also they saw that after the Huang Chao uprising, the Tang dynasty was in danger of breaking up. So there was actually a 53-year exchange vacuum between Tang China and the Japanese. While the Chinese, they sponsored the expenses of the envoy of the Japanese, but the Japanese still have to come up with their own money, and this was very costly for the aristocracy, right? They started to limit these kind of financial outlays, and at the same time, there were more and more merchant ships. So that means more on the people-to-people exchange instead of an official exchange between the two peoples. So this 53-year exchange vacuum was actually caused partly by the breakup of the Tang dynasty into the 5 dynasties and 10 countries, 五代十国 in China. And at the same time, Japan, no money left, so they tightened state budgets. With the collapse of the Tang dynasty, they stopped Japanese ships to the foreign lands. And during this period, the Chinese merchant ships could still sail from Hangzhou or the ports near the Yangtze River, Changjiang, right over here, where Jiangsu and Zhejiang are. And Sino-Japanese exchange was restricted to the Jiangnan, Fujian, Guangdong coastal areas, primarily in the south. With the start of the Song dynasty, this was actually a pivotal period for Chinese history. There is unprecedented development in industry, commerce, the monetary system, and cities. And now, Emperor Ichijo sent an envoy to the Song Emperor Song Zhenzong with the letter 盖因本国之东有祥光见，齐国速传中原，天子圣明则此光见 which actually loosely translates as the country in the east, me Japan, sees a bright light, the middle country emanates its brightness, which means Emperor Ichijo was actually very enamored of the Song dynasty. Especially Song Shenzong, he presided over a very active Sino-Japanese exchange during his reign. There were almost 70 visits between Song dynasty and Japan during this 160 years of Northern Song. Right? This converted Japanese attitudes, which were previously very passive, now became very active. Especially when these Song dynasty ships they arrived at Hakata, which is modern-day Fukuoka, they would then inspect the ship. Officials would inspect the ship itineraries and report to the capital. And with approval, the Song dynasty ships would be able to dock for commerce. And they actually have an area where they allow the envoys from Tang, from Sui, from Tang, all the way to Song dynasty. When they stay in Japan, you can stay in this area, right? So a special treatment for the Chinese people. So what happens during this Sino-Japanese exchange during the Song dynasty? What kinds of goods were traded? The Song dynasty, China exported precious things like eaglewood incense, sandalwood, precious birds like parrots and peacocks, as well as block print books and Tang brocade, which is similarly to like what you can consider as like LV, right, in the modern day. Whereas the Japanese exports, they sold to the Song dynasty alluvial gold, mercury, pearls, and decorated screens, as well as gold paste paintings. You can see actually the Japanese, they wanted to buy Song dynasty goods, Chinese goods, but they had to pay a lot. As a result, all the money went to China. And the Japanese government started to have some problems. At this moment, we would like to talk about Diaoran and his relationship with the Song Emperor Taizong. Right? In AD 983, the Japanese monk Diaoran, he boarded a Chinese merchant ship to enter the Song Empire. Right? He first landed at Taizhou, and he made his way to Tiantaishan, followed by Bianjing, to meet the emperor. And it is written in the historical records, Song Shi. Song Taizong was very curious about Japan, and Diaoran was the first person to give a very correct and objective account of Japan to the Chinese. And he presented many exquisitely made crafts, and he presented the dynastic annals and explained the 64 generations of Japanese emperors. And this made Emperor Taizong very curious that actually there is another land whereby you have a long lineage of dynasties. He also presented the Zheng Shi Zhu Xiaojing, which has already been lost due to all the different dynasties in China. So he was very happy to receive this from Diaoran. He was so impressed by Diaoran that he rewarded him with a purple robe, which is equivalent to a level 3 official, and gave him permission to live in the Temple of Country Revival, to visit all the temples in Luoyang, and even gave him a title called the Priest of the Law. right? So Diaoran received many treasures from the Song dynasty. One of Japan's earliest paintings of the arhats, the Luohan, was presented by the Song painter Jin Dashou. Another time, Diaoran was very impressed by the 1.6-meter wooden sculpture of Buddha and arranged an exact replica to be sent back, which is now in Japan a national treasure in Kyoto. And the emperor's gift of 5,048 scrolls of the Dazhang Jing, which he spent 12 years to make, he sent one copy to Diaoran. And Diaoran was very happy and very grateful to Song Taizong. So when he returned back to Japan, he wrote a letter. He was saying, my gratitude towards your majesty of the 4 oceans higher than the 5 holy mountains, exceeding the ancient emperors, continually refreshed. Well, today when we read this text, we may think it sounds a little obsequious, but the second sentence actually says, Diaoran departs from the cave of the phoenix to return to the hole of ants. This statement actually, Mr. Reinosuke, his emphasis was that the Japanese attitude towards the Chinese was one of, China is a very big country. It is a big land. It is like the cave where you have a phoenix, a fenghuang. And me, I'm a Japanese, I am like an ant. I'm so small compared to you, right? So now I return to my small hole. And no matter where I am, I will look up to the great country, China. Right? With one hand, I move my brush, and the other, I wipe my tears. As the paper stretches, so my soul shudders. Such is my gratitude. So Mr. Reinosuke writes that this reflected the intimacy and the deeply felt awe of the Japanese people towards Chinese culture. They really respected and loved Chinese culture. And this had a very strong influence on Japanese culture. The Japanese people, they have several characteristics. One of them is they have a disposition to learning, to improving, and to creating. So when they absorb the Chinese traditional craft, for example, this Luodian Gongyi, which is a mother of pearl inlay, and they have their local, which we call the makie, they transform it into something else. Right, and you can see the elements of Chinese art now melded together with local Japanese art into something different, something new. For example, we have the fan, and the round fan originated in China, and when the Japanese brought it back, they transformed it into a folded fan, and then exported it back into China, right? Besides that, the Japanese, they also absorbed Buddhism, tea drinking, tableware, painting, and paper making, right? Even though they stopped official exchanges for 90 years, Japan continued to absorb Chinese culture, and in so doing, completely transmutating a foreign culture into the local. In this way, nurturing an independent culture and gaining the confidence to spread its own. Diaoran then ordered his disciples to continue to enter China and to learn, to keep learning, right? By this time, Zen Buddhism had already planted itself in Japan, but yet to flourish. The ascendant warrior class now found in Mr. Reinosuke's words an emotionally charged philosophy with no need for words, one that strives for absolute consciousness, where life and death are one. And that is Zen Buddhism. And this Zen Buddhism was absorbed strongly by the Bushido. Mr. Reinosuke then proceeds on to talk about the Mongols, onslaught of the Mongols, the battle of the barbarians. During the time of the 5 dynasties and 10 countries, the nomadic peoples of the north the grasslands. They invaded the 16 Yan counties to found the kingdom of Liao. And this was followed by the Zhechen to found the kingdom of the Jin in the year 1115. And thereafter, the northern Song still tried to buy over the northern kingdoms of the Jin, the Liao, and the Xixia, keep trying to bribe them with money, especially with silver and silk, but to no avail. Eventually, the northern Song dynasty collapsed. Okay, and you can see when Song previously was a unified country, it was now left with only the southern Song, right? They tried to negotiate for peace with the Jin, and it stabilized for a while. At the same time, during this period, the Jiangnan in Zhejiang province prospered. Now there's a Japanese called Taira no Taramori. He challenged the authority of the Dazaifu, which had complete monopoly over the Song merchant trade. And his son, Taira no Kiyomori, now built another port at Kobe to allow Song ships to berth. This was a direct challenge to the prevailing rule. And that's why in the year 1185, their family was exterminated. And now Japan entered the Kamakura shogunate period. The Japanese merchants had now learned Chinese shipbuilding techniques and could now cross frequently from here to China. And they can export high quality pine and woods to China. This Song influence on Japan would continue for a longer period of time. The Song, one unique characteristic of the Song dynasty was the emperor made 3 commandments, one of which was never to kill scholars. And as a result, we have on the top right-hand corner a phrase called several poetry lines. 书中自有黄金屋 means if you learn enough, you study enough, you can become wealthy, right? Chinese currency and economic development started to very high levels, and the Northern Song administration created an enormous amount of bronze coins, but you started to have inflation. In order to fund this growing bureaucracy, because you can't kill officials, you have to keep supporting them and pay them salaries. The Southern Song coinage had to be exported, and this was exported all the way to Malacca, India, Central Asia, the Middle and Far East, and it is equivalent to today's US dollar, right? Everybody traded with Song currency. Japan tried to make bronze coins, but they were not successful because their smelting technology was not as advanced as the Song. So the demand for the superior Song coins was very high, and Song coins now flooded Japan. The Southern Song administration now imposed bans to avoid currency outflow, which led to a lot of smuggling. Paper currency developed, and Japan was soon drawn into the Song monetary policy spiral. So we can see Japan's neglect of Jin and fervent for Song, because Jin was the nomadic tribes that tried to invade the Song China, was really 2 sides of the same coin, where there is an intimacy towards and a respect for the Han Chinese and its ruling class, made the Japanese stand on the side of the Chinese. The Japanese perceive the Jin as barbaric, as the Chinese perceive, which means since the Chinese considered the Jin people as barbaric, that's why the Japanese will also consider the Jin people as barbaric, and that's why will not trade with the Jin people. No diplomatic relations. So we have another type of the barbarians, the Mongols, which formed a dynasty in 1280. Kublai Khan actually proposed to invade Japan. He sent 6 orders to Japan, all of which were ignored. But when the Southern Song collapsed in 1276, actually the Yuan dynasty made 2 attempts to invade Japan. The first was the Battle of the Wenyong之役, where 28,000 army strong and 15,000 strong navy and a fleet of 900 actually invaded Tsushima, this island, before crossing over to the Kyushu, right? But there was a lot of the storms that capsized the fleet. And subsequently, in 1281, after the Song Dynasty collapsed, the Battle of the Yong'an, whereby again the Yuan army of 140,000 and a fleet of 4,400 unfortunately met with a typhoon and sank. The Japanese pushed on, and only 30,000 Yuan soldiers survived. Right. So there is Mr. Ryunosuke. He made a very interesting observation of the Japanese attitude towards the Mongols. Right. In 1294, Kublai Khan dies without establishing diplomatic ties with the shogunate, and the Japanese ships continue to visit China. And during this period, the Zen Buddhism flourished. Monks entered and tried to absorb this advanced culture, accelerating Japanese literary and calligraphic development. But the Yuan and the shogunate governments were suspicious of each other. And the Yuan government now started to impose tax on the Japanese merchants, right? But the Song government, they said they want, the Japanese government, they said they wanted Song coins, right? And they didn't want to pay taxes. So in 1307, the Japanese merchants clashed with the Yuan officials and they ransacked several Chinese cities. They also invaded Mingzhou and they burned down the governor office with sulfur, right? And at the same time, Japanese pirates started to invade the Korean peninsula. So a lot of tension at this time between the Mongol government and the Japanese people. And Mr. Ryunosuke made this observation when writing this book back in 1977. Mr. Ryunosuke researched a lot of historical Japanese historical texts, and which can see on the left side about several books by Japanese authors, and the titles of these authors are written as Yuan Kou. Well, in Chinese characters, Yuan actually refers to the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols, and the term Kou is used to describe foreign barbarians, which means to say the Japanese, because the Chinese people saw the Mongols as barbarians, the Japanese people also saw the Mongols as barbarians. Now, this is a little unique because the Chinese people would also consider Japanese people as barbarians. So you have the barbarians themselves considering another group of barbarians as barbarians because the Chinese thought them as barbarians. So this is a very unique aspect of the Japanese psyche. Unfortunately, the Mongols were not good at managing finances, and they used gold as their currency. And the largest empire in the world needs a lot of military funding. Eventually, it collapsed when Zhu Yuanzhang advanced. So the last Yuan emperor, Shun Yuandi, he escaped northwards at midnight, ending about 100 years of Mongol rule. And at the same time, in 1331, the Kamakura shogunate went bankrupt. In Japan, now it was divided into the northern and southern dynasties. So in China, about 700 years ago, we have the Chinese northern and southern dynasties. Now we have in Japan also divided into the Japanese northern and southern dynasties. Zhu Yuanzhang, he sent envoys to both sides because he wasn't sure who would represent Japan. He sent envoys to the Ashikaga administration, and then there was a lot of misunderstanding between the Ashikaga administration and Zhu Yuanzhang. At the same time, the Ming premier Hu, he obtained South administration support to mount a revolt. So Zhu Yuanzhang now broke relations with Japan. When Ashikaga's efforts ended Japan's 50-year division in 1368, at the same time, the Koreans, they acknowledged the Ming dynasty. As a result, the Ming dynasty supported the setup of the Joseon dynasty under Li Chengui. So we have the Korean now being a separate government. During this period, between the 14th and the 16th centuries, there was a lot of pirate activities. And we can see on the left, the pictures of the Japanese invasions. And on the right, the painting of Xiu Ying. And you can see this screen painting, the Chinese people fleeing away from Japanese, and the way the Japanese are depicted, not wearing clothes properly, with no shoes on their feet, and the hair looks strange. So this was how the Chinese viewed the Japanese as inferior and non-civilized. So Zhu Yuanzhang, he wrote this. He was very contemptuous of the Japanese pirates, and he tried to write this poem on his fan in a way to control them. So the merchants, Japanese merchants, they started to trade with the Ming in a very uneasy manner, and under the Yongle Treaty, were allowed to enter Japan, these Ming merchant ships. And there was still trade between the goods, because the Japanese people still love to buy Chinese goods. There were more than 59 countries trading with the Ming, especially we know Zhenghe, Xiaxiyang. And but at the same time, there were also many Japanese pirates during this period. Okay, so this was characterized by a strong exchange, especially the Japanese monks who visited China, and they absorbed their painting techniques and the culture, the high culture, and even the Ming Emperor Xianzong called the paintings of Seishu Toyo as invaluable gems of rare times. So eventually, under the General Qi Jiguang, they were successful in defending Taizhou, but eventually they could not resist the entrance of the Qing dynasty. And finally, in 1661, the Ming Empire ended, and Qing now unified the whole of China. So a little bit about the Zheng family. Zheng Chenggong, his father, Zheng Zhilong, was actually born in Fujian, but married a Japanese woman, and they had a son, Zheng Chenggong, who went to China at age 7. And Zheng Chenggong actually tried to overthrow the Qing government to try to resume back the Ming government, right? And as a result, was conferred the Yanping Wang and Guo Xingye, father of the country, even though he wasn't of royal blood. And this was where he was active on the right-hand side, in areas in red, where Zheng Chenggong tried to overthrow the Qing government. He also successfully obtained control of Taiwan back from the Dutch and drove out. He finally died at 39, and his son Zheng Jing was continuing his resistance to Qing. This is a very interesting element why Mr. Reinosuke talked about the Zheng Chenggong, because Zheng Chenggong, their family, they tried to overthrow the Qing government, and they tried to get Japanese support. Okay, so they used ammunition, tried to get soldiers from Japan, and this is all written in the Hosokawa family records, right? As much as 16 times. even though the Tokugawa shogunate already announced closure of the country. Right. Eventually, in 1683, the Qing defeated Zheng family and now absorbed Taiwan as part of the Fujian province. Now, Zheng Chenggong, although he was of Chinese descent, but he has been assimilated into Japanese culture, and he even has a Japanese name called Teisei Ko. And we can see on the right a poster of his stories being talked about in Japan, right? How the Chinese 国姓爷 becomes a Japanese 国姓爷, and we can see some kabuki elements, whereby actually looking at this screen, you can see it is a picture of Quanzhou. Right, so Chinese culture has been so thoroughly absorbed into Japan that even the Chinese person has become a Japanese person. Right? This is the extent of the absorption. Zheng's family to seek Japanese help means that the Japanese actually have very deeply entrenched emotional affinity towards the orthodoxy of Chinese rule. And this emotional affinity stems from the innate Japanese psychological admiration towards the advanced civilization and culture, the source of which is China. So for China to become advanced, it has to be as close to China as possible, as much as teeth is to lips. So when the barbaric tribes try to overthrow the Han Chinese government, then the Japanese people will be very revolted towards these tribes. And this deeply entrenched emotional affinity and staunch belief in the orthodoxy of Han Chinese rule are two facets of the same psychology, resulting in the Japanese to treat with scorn and contempt the barbaric elements that Han Chinese would consider disdainful, even when the Japanese themselves are also regarded as barbaric. So it is a very, very contradictory Japanese attitude towards the Chinese. And when we move on to the modern era, especially Saigo Takamori, he wrote in Quest, right? The Japanese didn't like the backwardness in Korea, so Korea must modernize itself just like Japan. So this started a series of war in Korea, and China, the Qing government was drawn into this war, and it resulted in the defeat of the Qing fleet, North Sea Fleet, to sign the Treaty of Shimonoseki, the Maguan Tiaoyue, by Li Hongzhang, which is to recognize the Korean independence, but actually to allow Japan to have influence in Korea. This planted the roots of the 1904 Russian-Japan War. The numerous unequal treaties signed between the Qing and the West made Japan realize that in order to protect the interests in Korea, they must now consider to invade the Chinese mainland. Turning point in the relationship, because for 2,000 years, Japan had always been learning from the culturally advanced Chinese, now change. Previously, they had an inferior complex. The Japanese now saw the Chinese with contempt and as enemies even. This shows that the Japanese nature is defined by a very unique characteristics that will change with circumstances, and that one looks up to others more superior than itself. And this can easily change, and when you have the objectives changed, you will relentlessly pursue them. And we saw a series of non-friendly relations starting to build up over time. Even when the exchange students to Japan now far exceed the West, the Chinese students, they wanted to build a new country, a modern country with the fall of the Qing dynasty. And with the arrival of Sun Yat-sen in Japan, Miyazaki Toten becomes his good friend and devotes his life to helping Sun's revolutionary cause. but it didn't stop the Japanese ambitions in China, and now leading to the 21 demands, whereby the 21 possessions in Shandong are to be transferred to Japan. Of course, when the Japanese tried to take over, and the Chinese government was split into two, the northern and the southern, the diplomatic efforts failed. And now Mr. Reinosuke writes, the Japanese unabashed expansionist policy towards China was a push factor for the May 4th movement. So Japan now starts to begin its full-scale invasion of China, because even Tanaka Giichi's petition to the Japanese emperor writes that to subjugate China, we must first subjugate Manchuria and Mongolia. To subjugate the world, we must first subjugate China. So this you can see, there's actually the Japanese ambitions to first take over China and then to take over the world. And we have come to a last person called Hasegawa. Actually, this lady, even though she was born in Japan, but she helped the Chinese to fight against the Japanese soldiers, especially when the Japanese government described her as a traitor, but she still continued, you can call me traitor, I'm not afraid. I don't want to be part of this Japanese government which creates hell for other people. And Mr. Reinosuke writes that she was willing to use herself to bridge China and Japan. And through her, the Chinese could see the light of conscience in the Japanese. So when we come towards the end of this today's session, in 1978, 27 years after the World War II, finally the two countries signed a treaty of peace and friendship. And it is interesting that Mr. Sun Yat-sen, on his last visit to Japan in 1924, he asked Japan to consider carefully that you have learned the kingly benevolence culture from China, and you have also seen the culture of brute force from the West. You must carefully consider what you want to pursue. Now, this is very ominous, considering that Japan would invade China in 7 years' time. So as I read this and conclude this reading, as I read this, I had several reflections, and I think I would like to share them with the audience here today. Through the Han, Tang, Song, and Ming dynasties, China's finest culture, Japan has already absorbed it. The Japanese think that actually the source of China's culture is now already in Japan. So when they depict Chinese people with Chinese characters, they now write the names using the foreign characters. So they themselves are actually the Chinese now, not the Chinese themselves. Japan has always had a sentiment of Han Chinese orthodoxy, and the fall of the Jin caused by the Xianbei invasion, and as well as the fall of the Song caused by the Mongol invasion, this was a very painful and angry moment for the Japanese. And the Tokugawa scholar Fujito Toko even supported the king to suppress the barbarian. But who is the barbarian? The Japanese themselves, actually the barbarian, right? But now, when he sang of the heavenly land and the western land, this heavenly land is not China. It has become Japan. And the western land has now become China. So the orthodoxy has now been transplanted from China to Japan. For 1,000 years, Japan has regarded China as a teacher to learn from, to improve oneself. But in less than 50 years, China now had to learn from the Japan. When 1894, the Qing-Japan War was the turning point. When this orthodoxy has been transplanted to Japan, the Manchu is now the barbarian. And now Japan is here to liberate China, because Japan has taught itself to absorb everything about China. And since the Chinese people are now under the barbarian rule, it should be reinstated towards the Orthodox. So a common cultural source, but a different interpretation. This is the modern relationship between the two countries. Matsuhito overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate to realize the king rule, right? And this is actually to learning from the Chinese ancient texts. Whereas the Emperor Guangxu tried to modernize, but was unsuccessful. And this was replaced by his uncle, Emperor Xuantong, which was made into a puppet ruler by the Japanese when the Showa Emperor himself planned and directed the invasion of China and started the Pacific War. Eventually, to terminate in 1945 as unconditional surrender, but allowed by America to maintain divine status. So last year, when we talked about the 50th anniversary of the normalization of ties between these two countries, we have a poem from the Tang Dynasty, 青山一同，一道同云雨. Okay, so this actually means that Chinese characters are not just the lingua franca between the two peoples, but it is the melding of the two cultures over 2,000 years. And Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, said that the turbulence of 100 years still continues, but final sign fate at 50. This is 50而知天命. It is an excerpt from the Chinese classic, the Analects. And when we talk about the 50th anniversary between the two countries, we should remember what is the purpose. The former ambassador to the US, Sugiyama Shunsuke, writes again that America has only 200 years of history, but the Sino-Japanese ties date back to 2,000 years. So it is still remembering the 2,000 years of a good exchange. We now look back a little bit at 1972, when there was the watershed moment for East Asia, which is the resumption of ties between Premier Zhou Enlai and Prime Minister Kakue. Right? They managed to negotiate many foreign issues. And this was a very crucial period for China because it was essential to China's economic takeoff in the next few decades. And today, this year, 2022, marks the 50th anniversary of the normalization. And Mr. Kong Xuanyu, in a statement to Japan, he says that history has taught us that peace, friendship, and cooperation is always the right direction, and we should strengthen youth exchange, and so that we can pass this Japan-China friendship from generation to generation. And in turn, Hayashi Yoshimasa, the Japanese foreign minister, acknowledges the 2,000 years of deep cultural commonality and the responsibility for future generations. So with this, I end today's session on 2,000 years of Sino-Japanese exchange. I hope I've tried my best to squeeze 2,000 years in 1.5 hours. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Shaoming, for the excellent guided reading of this book. Okay, I know Shaoming has spent a tremendous work to prepare for this presentation because he did a lot of research and also the translation from the original version to English. Okay, now let's come to the Q&A session. Let's say if you have any question or any queries, or you have any reflection from today's sharing, yeah, you can just unmute yourself and have interaction with Shaoming. Yeah. Okay, you can either ask in English or Chinese. If you ask in Mandarin, Shaoming will respond in Mandarin. You can also raise your query in English. So both language can, no problem. Okay, maybe Xiaoming, I shall start with a simple question first. Maybe we can start the discussion. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe after because you did the same sharing last year and today. Wow, it's really a wonderful sharing of this book. Actually, comparing the Chinese version and understand the English version again actually gives me some reflection also. Yeah, maybe I will address my inquiry in English. Let's say, okay, what do you think? Let's say, and in view of the current, I know actually in realistic sense there are some tensions still tensions in the relationship between China and Japan now. Yeah, but what do you view? Let's say, if how do we view the future? Let's say the future trend of this cultural relationship. Okay, let's only address the cultural side. How do you view the future trend of the cultural exchange between China and Japan, in your understanding?
Okay. From my understanding, firstly, let me just go back this slide. I think I will answer this question with reference to slide 65, which I show on screen now, with a statement by Wang Yi. Wang Yi says the turbulence of 100 years still continues, and this turbulence actually starts from the war in 1895. And when we look back, when we talk about the modern period, especially within the last 20 years, with China's growth and strength in terms of economy and politics and diplomacy, and in terms of political stature, I think China's influence will still continue to grow. And this is something that the Japanese will have to acknowledge. They cannot run away. So culturally, there will still be more and more exchange on the people-to-people level, I think. I think especially when on this slide again, on slide 67, Mr. Hayashi Yoshimasa mentioned that bilateral trade has grown 120 times. So in terms of economic exchange, there is a huge volume. Both countries are now the top trading partners for each other. And Japan will be still very cautious in accepting influence. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Xiaoming. Okay, well, we have a question from the chat box, and the reference is asking, okay, in Mandarin, okay, 日本吸收了中国文化的精华，尤其是汉字书法和礼仪方面，但现今的中国是否已经失去了这些精华？ Okay, Xiaoming, I think you can respond in Chinese if you want.
OK， 日本确实是吸收了很多那个中国的精华，然后有很多的最好的东西呢，其实在日本是保留着的，但是呢，在保留的过程中也是有一点点的那个日本的风格，所以现在从我的观点哈，日本呢，它是这个民族呢是比较也比较守旧。也比较守旧，所以有些东西它确实是保存得很好。但是呢，中国的文化它有一种魅力，它一种变化的魅力。所以呢，是在我们在接受现有日本文化的中国元素的时候呢，我们会把它融入到现有的那个中国社会的状态。然后呢，过程中还会，我认为还会输出一个完全新的东西，所以也就是说，可能现今的那个中国文化，它可能在去接受日本文化的中国元素的时候，会有一种再创造的一个过程，这是我的一个 一个斗胆的一个想法。
好的，谢谢少明 ，Thank you. Okay, any other inquiries or any sharing? Okay, you can express your idea and opinions freely, and I'm sharing with Xiaoming. And Xiaoming, maybe I also address another interesting phenomenon. I think you also shared this with us before. I think during in one book session, actually talking about some modern Chinese vocabulary. Yeah, especially maybe, for example, maybe 宗教, maybe 经济, maybe some other interesting words. Interesting words. Actually, they are translated by, how to say, they are imported from Japan, especially during the late 19th century or early 20th century. Yeah, actually these words actually are some, quite a lot of words from, these kind of words are imported from Japan. They say maybe those characters, they are Chinese, but in Japan they just assembled it into becoming a word. And actually these words become those kind of, we call, becomes a fixed phrase, a professional phrase in China really. So how do you view this kind of cultural phenomenon?
This is actually a characteristic of the Japanese people. They are very good at learning, and also combined with their very deep understanding of Chinese culture. This resulted in, whilst they have the capability to use Chinese characters, but how Japan has modernized itself in order to become modernized and to westernize some of the ideas and concepts that they had to take from the West and to express it in a Chinese language, Chinese characters. So they combine these elements into multiple characters to be used in a modern manner. So this is actually a very new invention, and since then it has become a very important element for modern Chinese vocabulary. Yeah, this again shows that the Japanese, they are really good at learning, and I think as today's sharing shows, Mr. Rhinosuke himself acknowledges that when the Song Emperor wrote to Diaoran, and he also saw that the Japanese people, they have absorbed a lot. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any other reflection from the audience? You can ask in Chinese also, no problem. Okay, let's say if no other further questions, I think today we can have a quickly summary of today's session. Okay, thank you to Xiaoming for the wonderful preparation for today's sharing. And actually, after rereading this book, it also gives us some thoughts that maybe both Chinese and Japanese people, we should work together and try to make an effort to contribute to a new everlasting relationship. Not only not only the cultural side, maybe also political and many other aspects, so that both cultures, we can continue our life in engaging the constant exchange with each other. I think this will do good to both parties. Yeah, okay, that's my reflection for today's sharing. Yeah, thank you, Swami, for the excellent guided reading of this chapter. And actually, this our book club,萃英Book Club, is our effort to try to engage the more friends with the second language medium to promote the culture. We are trying our best. Actually, we did the one of the English sharing, I think a few years ago, and now is the second chance to try. Hopefully everyone can give us support and maybe can give us some more input so we can do it better. Also, thank you so very much. Okay, now maybe I should do some another forecast of our next upcoming events. Okay, our next upcoming sharing session will be 2 weeks later, which is the 29th of October. The same time will be 3:30 to 5 p.m. And the sharing will be conducted by myself. I will give a guided book reading for this book called 孟子大义 by Mr. Tang Wenzhi. It's actually the essence of these measures. The measures is a Greek philosopher in ancient China. So in this book, I will do some summary of the essence of this measures thought, mainly from Mr. Tang Wenzhi. He's a great scholar in China also. Yeah. Okay, today we can end our session here. And last time we can have some event. We can take our photo together. So if you are convenient, you can just show your radio so we can take a photo together. Okay, so maybe you can end your sharing first.
Okay, sure.
Sharing first. Yeah, we can have a photo together. Okay, 大家准备好了吗？ Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you, Xiaoming. Yeah, we shall see you. Yeah, in 2 weeks' time. Okay, bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye bye.